The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com weekly sale. Go to StarCityGames.com/sale because this week you can get back to basics. Save 15% off of all basic lands from now until August 16th at 10:59 a.m. This is the perfect sale for Cube because I'm remaking a Cube right now. You're probably remaking a Cube, and if you're not, maybe you should, because 15% off of basics is huge, and you get every single basic to choose from. And there's so many fancy ones and so many great basics. 15% off is a massive, massive deal. Now, until August 16th at 10:59 a.m., go to StarCityGames.com/sale to get back to basics and get 15% off of all your basic lands. The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. If you want to get the coolest Magic t-shirts and hoodies and stickers, go to coalesceapparel.shop. And if you find something you like, use gift code SCG to save 10% off at checkout. That's coalesceapparel.shop. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Welcome back, one and all, to the 540, where you are going to experience Landho 2. Everyone loves a sequel today. I am your first host, of course, Justin Parnell. You can find me on Twitter at jparnell1. And my co-host, I don't know if he'd be the skipper or the captain. Maybe a little both, maybe a little neither. I don't know.
I think that skipper would be, well, I don't know. Depends if you are the host and I am the co-host, or if we're both co-hosts, at which point we would just kind of trade back and forth. But
yeah,
anyway.
I would say, given evidence of the last 20 odd episodes, you could make the argument no one is steering the ship.
That's a very good point. I do have a name, though. My name is Ryan Overturf, and I am aboard.
But not bored, because we're talking about something very exciting today. Just a board.
Yeah, just a board. We're here to talk about lands in Magic the Gathering, which I think are an essential part of the game that helps make Magic what it is today and allows Magic to continue being what it is. Conversations popping up, as it does now and again, about lands being outdated from people who don't get it. But lands are important, and we're going to give them the respect they deserve here on the 540.
That they've earned. Like you said, Magic as a game system really has cornered the market so much that other games have opted to move away from that type of game mechanic entirely. And I always see people come over from other games that have come over from Hearthstone or almost every other game, really. And they're like, lands, these seem dumb and unnecessary. And it's difficult for me to not react to that, because I know in the most cases they're right. But in my heart and my soul, I know that they just don't know that they don't know. how great lands are.
I'm just going to go on a little mini rant here because I can't help myself.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah. So I've played I've dabbled in a number of the non-Magic games, some of them more closely emulating Magic's resource system, some of them deviating more dramatically. I've played a good amount of Hearthstone, and I got to say, playing games where your opponent can never brick when their draw is always live, you just play more games that are over before they ring the bell. Like, you can navigate as well as you can, and it's like, all right, everything is all balanced out. I did my part. I just need to fade one draw step, but oh, their deck's all spells. The game was fucking over. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how well you played. Like, if you remove lands, you're just shifting variance. It's just going to exist somewhere else in the game.
That's true. That's 100% true. And I think people argue whether lands are a feature or a bug from that very angle. Well, I always have agency over everything, and it's always funny. And there's no way for me to not turn this into a debate with someone on the internet by saying this, but it's always funny to hear people that have played Magic after playing Hearthstone and are like, oh, lands makes too much variance. I'm like, dog, every third card says random on it. So
yeah, and I'm not saying like better or worse, but if your argument is less or more variance, it's just different. It's all just different. And like, you don't like lands. I get it. I do.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is our show.
Yeah, and I do too. And for what it's worth, I don't dislike Hearthstone. I just think that the argument is funny. It's all like, look, the people that designed all of these games, there's variance introduced, and the reason that variance plays a part in it is because if you remove variance, the best player would win 100% of the time.
Do you know how horrible games would be if the best player always won?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Dominion, for what it's worth. And I like deck building games, but that's quite different. Which is, I don't want to get into that other tangent, but yes, it is. When you have those games, they can be very frustrating. I don't know, Ryan. I know you're a D&Der. I don't know how often you play board games.
I play board game. Well, lately not as often
sure.
as more normal times, but I did get some friends together, played board games kind of the bulk of Saturday this week, and
that's good.
Own a small selection myself, but yeah, more than most people, certainly.
Okay, yeah, above average amount of board game playing. So there's a game that I own, which is the only the game with essentially no randomness that is entirely predetermined by the players. The game is called Photosynthesis. Have you heard of this game?
Yeah, I've played Photosynthesis.
Okay, Photosynthesis. So this is a game that is, it looks very pleasant. You are basically, the point of the game is to plant forests in a tree, or in a plant forests in a tree, Jesus. Plant trees in a forest and collect light to plant more trees in a forest. And it is a very unassuming game. However, I often tell people before we play, I'm like, just to let you know, this is the most brutal, unforgiving game in my game library. It is possible, and I fully believe this, it is possible to lose the game on the first turn before you even fully understand the game. Because there's no randomness in this game. You are simply placing pieces on a board, and the only randomness is whatever your opponent chooses to do with their pieces. And it is a multiplayer game, which makes this even more frustrating. So oftentimes the best player will simply just win. And there are people that have introduced this game to that really love it. And those are generally the more competitive players that are like, I want to try to get better at this game to win. And there's people that are like, well, you're just better. You're going to win whenever we play. And I'm say, yes, unless you make a point to get better at this game, that is going to happen every single time. And that is a frustrating experience for people. And when you remove the variance, getting back around to card games, you tilt games more towards that. And that really narrows the pool and the audience of people who ever to play any sort of game, whether it's a card game or a board game or what have you. Which is why not only Magic, as a pioneer of the card game, and Richard Garfield's design of that is so genius, but the mana system that he's put together. But even beyond that, we're talking about lands today. And lands do a lot more than just add a single color of mana. And that's why we love them. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. From a drafting perspective, not from a design perspective. If you want to hear about that, go back to episode 23 last week. And you can hear us talk about all about lands from a design perspective for an hour and a half or so.
Mm-hmm. But we do have something we were planning on doing before we get into lands, now that we've gone off a bit about something else entirely. But there's a new Magic set coming out. Can you believe that, Justin?
I couldn't believe it. Couldn't possibly believe it. Couldn't possibly believe it. I'm still just learning what all of the cards and adventures in the Forgotten Realms do. In between that, they've started to release digital only cards on Magic the Gathering Arena. I've certainly not read all of the words on those.
I am a step ahead of you. I have moved on to forgetting what many of the cards in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms do.
I'm not quite to that step yet. Smart though. But yes, Ryan is right. So last week in our time, they previewed a handful of Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards. And they only previewed 7 cards, and a number of them, like 5 of them, are certainly cube considerations. We just kind of want to touch on those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get into more depth later, but let's just rattle them off. We have a really nice referential card here, Champion of the Perished, a play on Champion of the Parish, and it's just a color shifted, creature type shifted card. So for 1 black mana, it's a 1/1 zombie. For another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And we talk kind of a lot about how close mono black aggro is for a lot of cubes, and how a little bit more support would be nice, and how zombies are a creature type that have a lot of relevant things. Like if you can make zombies matter, Gravecrawler and Cryptbreaker are just like 2 awesome 1-drops to have in the spread there. And I love this card.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I mean, you have to imagine going to Innistrad where there will clearly be zombies. I would say this is the best chance that we've ever had to have ubiquity across a large number of cubes for mono black aggro. I don't know what else is going to come alongside this card, but I know this card is foreboding of more zombies coming. They would not put it in the set if that was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm super excited for this card and the hopefully plethora of low-costed aggressive zombies we're going to be seeing in the next 3 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm betting on it and hoping for it.
Yeah. Okay. The next one, this one's super simple, but a very meaningful cantrip. And consider this is an instant for a single blue. You may look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard, then you draw a card. This is simply an opt that surveils. And if you don't know what surveil is, it is exactly what it says. You can look at the top card, and you can either put it back or put it in your graveyard, and then draw a card. Graveyards are things being in graveyards are generally better than things being in decks. So whenever you have the opportunity to put a card from a deck into a graveyard, I would say most of the time it is beneficial. So this is not only is it another playable cantrip for spell slinging areas of a cube, but just a solid card that is in most cases more than a sideways upgrade to a card that an opt that I think a lot of people probably play in their cubes.
Yeah, I'd upgrade. I would argue that it's an upgrade over Opt, Thought Scour, and Mental Note. I guess Thought Scour an upgrade over Mental Notes, that kind of just carries forward. But all the same, I think that these cards are all generally cubable, and this is just a really nice one. And you can get into saying it's probably just better than Serum Visions. Lot to consider here with consider.
Yeah. It doesn't take me a lot to say something is better than Serum Visions. I don't even have to be a part of the conversation. Just hear 2 cards compared, and one of them Serum Visions, and I'll just pipe in and say that card's better than Serum Visions.
That tracks.
Yep.
Next one's a little less obvious, but still quite powerful. Infernal Grasp, 1 and a black, instant, destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. I mentioned that we're never really going to get 1 and a black terminate, but this is another tool in that arsenal. 2 life is not free. However, being able to kill anything is great. I have expressed an interest in Death Shadow and Cube. I have that as an archetype in the Tempo Tuber. This is a home run there, and is certainly going to see a lot more cube play than just that.
Yeah, I actually just love this card. We often talk about like making aggro work and putting in the resources to help aggro, and things that say lose 2 life with powerful effects attached to them often do just that, because this is certainly a powerful card for just about any deck that's interested in killing creatures. But anytime you are putting life payments on things, you're helping aggressive decks. So this is hitting a lot of boxes, I think, for a lot of cubes. I'm sure this is, I would argue this will be the most cubed card in this set without seeing the rest of the set. I'll make that. I'll stand on that box right now.
I'd give that to consider, but it's certainly going to show up a lot.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we'll see. Well, after seeing 7 cards, we've made a stand. There's no way either of us will be wrong.
Yeah, it's got to be one of the two.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have this is a multicolored card. Join the Dance. It is a sorcery for green and white. Create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens, and it has flashback of 3 green white. Just as a reminder of how powerful Lingering Souls is, in addition to what this card is doing. But it makes 2 tokens for 2 mana, which is something we've seen a million times. The sorcery, it's slow, 2 colors, but flashback is a pretty powerful mechanic. So if you're interested in making tokens, then this is something you will probably look at for a cube, especially if it's in green-white, which a lot of times that's the case.
Yeah, tokens are human too. That matters if you have the actual champion of the parish, Thalia's Lieutenant, Mayor of Averbrook. A lot of good bones for this card.
Last one's got more words on it.
Ren and 7. Oh, hooray, I get the big one. It's 3 green, 5 loyalty, legendary planeswalker Ren. It has 4 abilities, count them, 4. +1, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all lands cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So +1 to mulch. 0, put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. -3, create a green treefolk creature token with reach. And this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And -8, return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. This card is fine. This is kind of a specialty cube kind of thing. If you have a self-mill sort of thing, maybe independently a land theme with bounce lands and some quirky stuff there, or some combination of the two is where you're going to get the most mileage out of this card. But pretty specific, kind of cool in those contexts. Certainly doesn't rank in terms of best 5-mana green planeswalkers, though.
Oh, no. But I think that's really important because the things that you are ranking are extremely powerful cards. And I would say in some senses, so if we're comparing it to something like This Who Shakes the World, an arguably not very fun play experience card. And this is a card that cares about lands, that still has some power behind it. And I think it does more cool things than the other planeswalkers do. Nissa Who Shakes the World, Nissa Vital Force, even though they might be better cards. I think that if you are trying to flesh out kind of a landsy thing in your cube, but you're not pushing the power level as much as you can, then this is probably going to be a pretty sweet one.
Yeah, definitely. The more battle cruisery your cube is, I could see this being a pretty significant card for a cube where you would play 18 or more lands, such as the Live the Dream cube or the Chromatic cube. I definitely played a couple 19 land decks in the last iteration of Chromatic Cube that would have been pretty happy with Ren and 7.
Yeah. I think I would like to. I'll put it this way: I would enjoy playing a cube where this card was very good.
Yeah, outside of having to read the whole card, that's the big downside. But I assume at a point I'll know what it does.
Yeah. Although we did just come away from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm and Strixhaven, and there's a lot of words on both of those cards. So this isn't so bad. None of the abilities have there's more than 2.5 lines of text. Could be worse. Okay. So the reason we're here is talk about lands. So I would be remiss if we did not talk about the basic lands in Innistrad Midnight Hunt, because they might be some of the greatest basic lands in all of Magic.
I have a mighty need.
Yeah. So for those of you that have not seen these, they are full art. The art is entirely black and white, but for each different land, they have a very bold colored border that matches whatever the color of mana that the land is produces. So forest have this really bold green border, say basic land forest, and then have a very bold green forest symbol in the bottom middle of the card. And these just look incredible. And there's also planes, but the other 4 look really awesome.
Yeah, completely agree. The way that the border goes is they kind of close in like you would see with the Zendikar, mostly full art basic lands, but even there it's just kind of transparent so you can see through it, and you have that nice colored frame there. The swamps look great because they use purple for the border with the image being black and white, but plains just being white with the black and white, yeah, they do suck, but what else is new?
Yeah, I was saying before the show, I was like, whoever pitched it and then described all of them, and then at the end of the meeting they were like, oh yeah, we have to make planes too, and they were like, well, the rest of the idea is good, just run it anyway, and we'll sacrifice white mana yet again. But you know what, the honestly, all the rest of them just look absolutely incredible. These are going to make a whole swath of cubes, I would imagine.
Yeah, they're definitely going to be going right into my spooky cube. I've talked to a number of other people that own or are working on graveyard themed cubes, and because white is so bad at graveyard things because there's such a shallow pool for graveyard stuff, a lot of people do just cut white from their graveyard cubes, which makes this an even better cycle for those cubes.
Yeah, the old 4-card cycle.
Yeah.
These are incredible, and I can deal with the white ones looking very plain. There's always a chance. So I'm looking at these obviously in a picture. There's a very good chance these will look better in person because they won't look worse than this. And I'm not saying they don't look horrible, but compared to the rest of them, they are just like wildly boring.
Yeah, I could definitely see them looking a lot better when it wasn't coming off of a backlit screen.
Yes. So reserving judgment, I feel pretty good that this is going to be a home run land cycle. Pretty much everyone I've talked to about this has just loves these. So
yeah, people love them, and then some contrarians will tell you that they don't.
Yeah, that's fine. And you can tell them they're free to go back and play Hearthstone if they want. Don't have to deal with the lands. Okay. Speaking of lands, that is what we're here to do. But before we get into that discussion, I want to remind everyone this is kind of this is like both a part 3 and a part 2, because we talked about drafting just in general, kind of in the last, not the last episode, but episode 21 and 22. And then in episode 23, which was the last episode, we talked about lands from a design standpoint. So this is the culmination of both of those discussions, both from the land discussion and the drafting discussion, because the lands is obviously a critical component to the drafting portion and making up kind of the I don't know, one of the most fun parts of your cube, in my opinion.
Certainly among the most important.
Yes. Yeah, if you're interested in having people play colors that are greater than 1 in your cube, then I think lands are pretty critical. And we can all agree that is often a fun thing to do. All right, Ryan, anything else before we get into the discussion today?
No, we've gone on long enough. It is time to get down to drafting the lands. All
right, it's time to do it. We're going to take a quick break and be back in just a moment.
Listen up, gamers. I have some huge news. If you haven't heard, the SCG Tour Online is back, and we're giving away cash prizes, tens of thousands of MTG Arena gems, MTG Arena Qualifier Weekend invitations, MTG Arena Championship invitations, and the big one, Star City Games Invitational invitations. You heard that right. The Invitational is back, and that's going to be at SCGCon. SCGCon is back, taking place Halloween weekend. That's October 29th through the 31st in the Star City. That's Roanoke, Virginia, and you can qualify for the Star City Games Invitational via the SCG Tour Online. Stay tuned for more details on that. Those will be coming soon. And for more information on the SCG Tour Online, head over to scgtouronline.starcitygames.com. Now back to the pod.
So, drafting. We talked about kind of our theories behind drafting and what questions we ask when we go into a cube draft, what we're doing when we're in a draft, and how we're kind of building our deck or looking for archetypes. And a thing that I don't want to say we avoided, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about was lands, because we knew we were going to have this episode coming up. I am a huge fan of drafting lands. Just going to put it out there.
I like having a good clip of non-basic lands in my draft deck. I like the act of drafting them less.
Okay. I like drafting them. I love drafting lands. Drafting lands is a message of hope. Now, hope doesn't always work out. but when you draft the lands, it is a vision of what could be, what your deck could be, all of the things you could be able to do. And the beautiful thing is, sometimes you're able to do it. Sometimes you waste a pick on a land, and you maybe could have picked a card for your deck and in round 2, and you're like, man, as it turns out, I did not need this off color of mana. I didn't need this blood crypt as much as I thought that I did. But that's okay, because there are times it does work out, and you have this smorgasbord of a 3-color deck, and you're just able to hit. You go counterspell into Kolaghan's command, into Cryptic Command, and it's great. So the first thing I want to bring up is the math around drafting lands from a theoretical standpoint. Well, theoretical and a mathematical standpoint. Because as Ryan and I were talking about before the show, we both agree that it is art plus science. It is not certainly just science.
Yes. Yeah, like any important skill in Magic, such as sideboarding, which is, of course, an art.
Yes. Yeah,
True.
I think that's way less science.
Oh, yeah. Frankly, it's offensive that people use sideboard guides, not to diminish the work or consumption of anything on the website, starcitygames.com. You should definitely subscribe and read sideboard cards. They are useful as a baseline. However, you should be getting into the art of it if you want to be consistently successful, if you want to level up your game, changing stuff on the fly. And that's going to be a big no when it comes to drafting. We're going to give you a lot of general notes here, and Justin's about to break down just a lot of the math, why you want lands in your deck. But knowing when to deviate and having an idea of a deck that archetype, maybe that overlaps with a different archetype, where one is if you end up with a lot of lands, and the other one is when you have to struggle for lands. But I'll let you continue what you were saying anyway.
No. Well, now I need to take an aside off your side. I would like to make a statement that is going to be controversial, probably not to you based on what you just said, but to a lot of people. I believe that the concept of sideboard guides and people reading them leads to people losing more games as a result of those sideboard guides than winning games as a result of those sideboard guides.
I mean, just what happens when you run into deck where you don't have your sideboard guide? Or what happens when your sideboard guide is 3 days old? You know what I mean? Like, they're useful, but they're not timeless, and they are not context agnostic.
Yes, that's the biggest thing. What happens when you think you're using your sideboard guide to do a very specific thing that the author has tried to purport, and your opponent is not subscribing to the concepts that the author was suggesting that you follow? Thus, you have trapped yourself by following this guide that does not fit the circumstance you believed it did.
Yeah, which is all to say, always read the fine print. Sideboard articles are great because of the content provided, which is words beyond in and out. The fundamental and theoretical understanding will carry you a lot further.
It's the difference between educational and informative.
Yes.
Which I think is a really critical thing. You should be educated, and that's what those articles are often there to do. There's information provided, but the harder you subscribe to that, the more damage you are doing as opposed to the education you could be providing yourself by actually comprehending what's going on. But you know what? Sideboard guides don't really matter in Cube. Okay?
No, they don't come up.
So Okay, back to the main point. So from a mathematical perspective, and I'm talking here about the most traditional of cubes, where you are drafting 3 packs of 15 cards, you're going to end up with 45. There are cubes that draft a different number of cards. There are cubes that have a different number of lands, that don't have as much non-basic lands, that have more, etc. Obviously, when we talk about cubes, we could put an asterisk on everything. And there's sometimes that we go out of our way to say, we're going to put an asterisk on this, but a lot of times we just don't, because it would be saying it every 3 seconds.
Yep.
So I want to look at this from a very general standpoint. At the end of the draft, you're going to have 45 cards. If you've drafted 3 packs of 15, you're going to have 45 cards. You're not going to have less than that. You're not going to have more than that. There are some times that you have weird things with like draft matters cards from like Conspiracy, but overall, you're still going to end up with 45 cards. When you build your deck, in most cases, it is going to average, I do feel pretty comfortable saying it's going to average 23 spells and 17 lands. This is a very similar breakdown to most actual factual limited environments, and I think the same carries over for Cube. Now, I have certainly played more and less in Cube more often than I have in any draft format, except for Original Zendikar. If you're not playing 18, then that's you're tricking yourself. Anyway, 23 spells, 17 lands. You've drafted 45 cards. That means almost half of these spells that you have drafted, let's say you've drafted 45 spells, 22 of those spells are not going to make your main deck. And again, we're not going to talk about sideboards for now. Sometimes cubes, people don't even play with sideboards. Sometimes after you draft, you return all the cards you didn't draft back to the cube box. That's not my favorite thing to do, because I like playing best of 3, but that's a thing that people do.
Or if you're some of the people that I draft with, you just leave your sideboard on some table and you just forgot it existed. I don't know if that comes up in your group, but we get a lot of, whose sideboard is this?
Oh yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yes. I am the based on some of my past personal experiences, I'm very, I would say I'm hyper aware of where
I don't lose mine, because how else would I keep track of my life total?
Yeah, exactly.
That's my abacus. Exactly. I need that.
Yes. So in most cases, you're going to end up with 23 spells that you're going to want for your deck. That's going to leave you with 22 spells that you have drafted and not used. You have 17 lands for your deck. Even if you drafted all non-basic lands, that's going to leave you with 5 cards that would be your sideboard. I'm putting air quotes around that. Now, obviously, I'm pushing it to the extreme. I think I've only drafted a deck with 0 basic lands like 1 time. And I'm talking actual 0. Not like 1 or 2, but 0. And that was more to be like, I think I'm pretty close. Let me just draft these other ones that are going to be worse than basic lands, because I can say I didn't have to play any basics.
Yeah, you just wanted to climb the mountain.
Yeah, I want to climb the mountain. Exactly.
There's also a thing that happens when you get up to like 14, 15, like usually puts you over, where especially if you're a green deck, like you have fetch lands and like you have a rampant growth or something, and it's like I literally need to cut a non-basic land so that I can find something with all of these.
Oh, I've done that. 15 I think is even too close, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. So ultimately you have 45 cards, you have 23 spells, you have 17 lands to work with. The average amount, the average playableness of a card in a cube is going to be better than an average draft card just across the board, especially when you're getting in not the top 3 picks, and not top 5, not the top 10 picks, last 5 picks of any cube. Almost every single deck, and I would actually say that in general, every single deck can afford to draft some amount of lands, because you were taking these from a pool, in most cases, of spells you won't be able to play. Just when you look at it from that perspective should show you how important drafting lands is, because you have access to all of these cards. They're all cards people somewhere will want to play in a deck. Maybe it's not in the exact pool that you are drafting, but in some future pool or some past pool, every single card that's in that cube, someone has wanted for a deck. That is not the case, again, with normal limited. And the reason I keep referring back to that is because when it comes to forming a deck with spells versus lands. A lot of that translates over, but the difference is here you have an access in most cubes to draft a lot of non-basic lands, where even in the most generous draft formats, I'm talking like Shards of Alara, you're gonna, if you end up with like 4 non-basics, you're like shooting the moon with getting as many non-basics as you could possibly get.
Right. Yeah, you just typically end up with more in cube. Certainly in your monocolor decks, there's just at least some utility lands, but for mana fixing lands, cubes tend to have more of them. There's just more of a push for you to play multicolor cards in cube, and there are some sets that are more monocolor heavy, and like a booster draft set where there's a guild gate in every pack. That's a good amount of lands, but even then you're going to have better mana fixing in cube, and generally it's going to be the case where you just have more gold cards that incentivize you playing more colors.
Oh yeah, but even beyond that, like drafting lands, drafting cards that can fit into your land slot is still critically important, because you're still going to generally align with that 23 spell 17 lands, even if it skews by 1 or 2. So having those cards in your land slots is still going to be critically important to have basically be able to play as many of the cards as you can draft. That's always a good way to look at it for me, is I want to play more of the cards that I draft, just straight up. And that means that it's going to go away from my spells and go into my lands at some point. So I want to make sure that I can fill that out as much as I can.
Yeah, I really like, when I play a 3-color deck, my cubes more often than not, some of them are more specifically pulled in one direction or the other, but I really like cubes where decks are 2.5 colors, where you're not just like pretending that the colors don't matter. Like, they do matter, but you're a 3-color deck and you have like 8 or 9 non-basic lands. That's kind of the sweet spot for me.
Yeah, I think that's pretty indicative of a very normal cube deck in a lot of cubes, assuming that the designer of the cube has focused on allowing its drafters to draft lands and splash colors with, I don't want to say with impunity, but with ease, if they want to.
There's actually one of the 2 metagame considerations that, to the extent that it's possible, you want to be aware of when it comes to drafting lands. The first is the design of the cube. Are you abiding by what we talked about last week? Does the cube have 10 or so % of the cube is non-basic lands? Like, are they there for you to draft? How many colors are you set up to successfully, consistently draft? And that's also impacted by there's sort of an arms race with how highly other players draft lands. Based off everything Justin's saying, if I see a Blood Crypt in a pack now and Justin's in the draft, I'm not expecting to get 2 looks at that.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
So you got to be aware of the players like that are just not going to send the lands your way. So those 2 things are going to be back of your mind considerations the whole time for any cube draft.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's always tough. Like, it's feeling out a draft. It's always kind of fun to feel out a draft from a lands perspective. I've sat down at people that I've never 6 people I've never drafted with before. And they're all talking like, oh, so-and-so drafts lands. And I'm like, all right, well, let's see. And I sit beside this person. And sure enough, they draft 1 million lands. At the end of the draft, we're in the same 2 colors. They have 11 non-basic lands. I have 2. But the playable cards in my deck outpace the other person's playable cards double. And that's a consideration too. Like, does your group like to draft lands? And if they do, how can you take advantage of that?
Yes.
That doesn't mean, and just because someone likes to do a thing, that doesn't mean that you should always do the opposite thing. Sometimes it means you should fight them if you're in position to do so. And I mean literal position. Like, are you passing to this person?
Yes.
is a really good way. Or even if it's not directly to your left, if it's a seat down from your left, you're still largely passing to this person. And you can control the flow of that. But that's getting into passing dynamics, I think, especially that's just a lot of general limited stuff. But for cube, it comes up frequently with lands more so than anything else, because when people say they like to draft lands, that doesn't exclude them from drafting any particular archetype. You might have a guy that likes to draft mono red or mono white, mono green, or always wants to draft Reanimator, but lands is archetype agnostic for the most part. They could be doing 12 different things, or they could just not be in an archetype, just draft as many lands as they want and then play whatever spells they can get, which is definitely a strategy.
Yeah. Some players that draft a lot of lands, they just are really good at reading the draft, and they're taking lands broadly when it's correct to do so to end up in a set of colors. Like, I think that 9 or 8, 9, 10 non-basic land 3-color deck and having the best spells in those 3 colors is like the best possible position to be in a cube draft. Like some 3-color deck and appropriately valuing the lands has been the most successful vintage cube strategy for me, at least with the Magic Online vintage cube, outside of drafting mono white when it's open, because that can be kind of nonsense. But just sticking to some lane. A few years back, Jeskai was where I stood, but like in the most recent iterations, I just draft Sultai decks, and there's like a lot of good gold Sultai cards, specifically Leovold, and just feeling out the draft to know what's going to wheel between Botanical Sanctum, Leovold, Baleful Strix, and just getting your 8, 9, 10 non-basics and your 23 great main deck cards, and being able to consistently do that. That is a form of drafting a lot of lands. Like, I'm trying to get 10 lands.
Big time.
But I'm also trying to get specific lands. So there's a ton of nuance with players liking to draft lands. Even the monocolor decks, like if I want to force mono red, I told a story on the podcast about a vintage cube draft where I pack 1, pick 1 Mutavault to force mono red, and like Strip Mine is very much a land that you can pick very highly, and you plan on getting the 1 mana creature with power and toughness on the way back, just because that's how you think things are going to break.
I agree with all of that, especially kind of jumping back one to your kind of 3-color deck where you're focusing on getting 10 lands. I want to come back to that. I want to mention it here, but I want to come back to talk about this at a larger point later. But the more good stuff your deck is, you can generally afford to draft more lands, because you're simply going to be picking the best cards available for those colors that fit what your decks are able to do. And if you're drafting a Sultai deck and you have 9 lands that create 2 colors of mana, you don't have to worry as much about getting the very specific cards, because you're just going to be able to cast your cards easier on a more regular basis. Now, even though I agree, I think that in most cubes that is the case, but it's a very fine line, because the more focused you get, in most cases, the more focused for your deck you get, the ceiling for your deck often gets higher, but you have to be more strict in your assessment of what cards you need for your deck. And because of that often means you're going to be passing lands for those cards on a more regular basis. Yeah,
there's another balance there with cards that are better in 3-color decks versus in 1 or 2-color decks. I mentioned kind of threading the needle between monocolor or 3-color. Like a great example in the Vintage Cube, going with that Sultai example, is I really like the mono green deck. And if I get Created Oath Behemoth and Green Sun Zenith, Natural Order Raphellos, I'm trying to draft that deck. But if I start with Birds of Paradise and you pass me an Ashiok, well, I'm going to play the Sultai deck.
Yeah, because you're playing a more general deck, though, which is why you're going to be able to afford more of those lands.
Exactly.
Rather than trying to singularly focus on this thing. Where
the green deck, I'm like, I need these cards.
I have to pick this card.
Try to hoof them. That just makes my deck so much better. Where the Sultai deck is like, I'm casting spells that I can cast, and they're going to either 1-for-1, sometimes 2-for-1 you, or try to win the game.
Yeah. It goes back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago when I was talking about, get your mana if it comes up. When you're playing that single color deck, you have to draft Crater Behemoth when you see it. You have to draft Green Sun Zenith when you see it. Those are not cards you're able to pass. even though and when we say mono green, you might not be in mono. Maybe you're in green blue. Maybe you have mana dorks and you have like Edric, and you're trying to splash for something like that because that's how the draft broke.
I like that you went with Edric and not Oko.
Well, I wanted to go with a card that was had a low enough power level where I could argue of why you would be in it, not Oko was in the pack, thus you drafted it, and everything else became irrelevant. There's not a single card in Cube that makes the card Tropical Island or any single land more important than Oko does for Tropical Island and Breeding Pool and the like. Anyway. But you have to, when you're faced with those decisions, you're going to have to pass up lands. You might want, I want to get this Breeding Pool, but I have to get this Green Sunset. I have to get this Crater Opening. I have to get this Rofalos. Mm-hmm. I have to get this Land War Elves.
Yep.
When and the mono green is just a specific example. It could even be a 2-color deck where this is the case, but you are often going to be forced to pass lands more, even though you're like, I would like to have this, but I have to have this. Mm-hmm. Which this is a spell, a non-land spell that is central to the identity of the deck that you're trying to build. So to me, that's when it comes down, which is why I think land are so interesting to talk about, because it's really about opportunity cost of drafting them.
Yeah.
And it shifts kind of in the middle, it's somewhere in the draft, and it's different for every seat and every player that is drafting. You might have someone that is focusing on getting lands early, and they're going to spend their first 20 picks. They're going to get 8 lands, and they're just going to focus on picking as many lands as they can. Like, okay, well, I've largely set my mana base. I'm only going to pick another land or 2 along the way, and I'm just going to try to get the best spells. And like we were talking about with the mono green deck, or maybe the green deck splashing blue, that could be the opposite. But at some point, lands will be a focus, because it all comes back to the first thing that I said, which is just, it's like mathematically, you're going to draft 45 cards. You're not going to play them all. You're going to have times where you're like, am I going to play this card? Maybe it's a meaningful sideboard card, but if it's not, should I just draft this land that's like a okay land, but it's still going to be better than my 26th best card? Mm-hmm. And I think those are the times that you have to be able to learn to identify, and hopefully keeping that math of the actual draft in your head will help you figure out the times and you're like, no, I just should take this land because this card isn't going to necessarily make my deck if everything goes right.
For sure. And if it's something, let's just even get this more specific. When you talk about sideboard cards, if you're talking about something as weak as a naturalize, and not just as weak, but as available.
As available. Yeah, I think that's a better way to put it.
There's going to be more naturalizes, and you're going to sideboard them in sometimes. That might not even come up. But that land is going to be a potentially relevant factor of every game that you play. And you don't get extra looks at lands.
Generally not.
Yeah.
I would say any land that is a good land, you're not going to often see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm speaking more to a player who's in a seat that's drafting a 2, maybe 3 color deck, and you're on the fence. My spells, maybe this is going to matter as a sideboard card. If you already have drafted 8 lands, then sure, you don't have to give the 9th land that hard of a look.
Yeah, but again, if you're, I don't know, because it's you're kind of facing the same situation differently, because rather than being the 26th best card, if you have 8 lands already and you're going to be in a 3.5 color maybe deck, you're going to have a lot more opportunity to draft cards that are going to be more meaningful to your deck, just because you have more options than everyone else.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But just for the player who's trying to play like 3 to 5 colors, every land that they see can contribute to that until you have a few hard to cast spells. Whereas if you are specifically in blue-green or blue-green-black or just any 2 or 3 color pair, there's only one fetch, dual shock, fast land, whatever in that color pair, specifically for a 2-color deck. When the land in your 2 colors comes back around, that's typically a blessing. Yeah, more often than not, you should just draft it.
Yes, I definitely agree, and that's going to be a big topic what we're going to talk about here in a second. Okay, so the last thing I want to note when we're looking at it kind of from a math perspective is, and this is actually more of a feeling than it is math, but it can, at some point, the draft does turn into a math question. There is a point in time, like we were talking about earlier, where you will need to have some amount of basic lands because perhaps you have drafted cards that search basic lands out. Maybe this is Rampant Growth, maybe this is Kodama's Reach, but more likely it's something like Prismatic Vista, or a step down from that in Fabled Passage, or even something like Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds. And when you get into those cases, I actually think that it is easier for decks to have a larger group of those collectively to be able to play them alongside basic lands and have a more robust mana base than if you are really kind of squeezing them in to your non-basic land heavy deck. Ryan outlined something earlier of saying like, well, I have a Rampant Growth, I really have 2 basics. I think in reality, you probably want to have like 5 basics. Or even 6 basics, depending on how many of those you have, because you have a greater ability to interact with those basic lands. And because of that, those cards, the generic fixers, I would say in most cubes are generally less valued by a draft pool than cards that just outright fix your mana.
Yeah.
And when you can position yourself in that, you can take advantage of that situation as well.
They tend to go a little bit later, and they tend to be pretty good cards. Broadly,
they actually are very good cards.
Any
in most
card
cases.
that searches up a basic tends to accelerate your land, at least ones that show up in reasonably powered cubes. Like Search for Tomorrow is a solid turn 1 opener. Rampant Growth is great. I think that these cards are maybe undervalued even. Sakura Tribe Elder, you can run away with a lot of games if you open up on some fast mana. And they facilitate playing some different cards, whether you're talking about on the splash or being a true 3-color deck. It's tough to make Baleful Strix or Terminate, just 2 mana cards on the double splash work in your green deck, but it's not that difficult to Kodama's Reach into casting the Scarab God. And another note that I think is really interesting that I haven't really seen covered by any other writer, and maybe it has, but it's worth just pointing out. When you are playing cards that search for basic lands, be them Prismatic Vista, Kodama's Reach, I always make sure to run a number of basics of that type equal to my highest number of pips on a card. So an example of that, it might be tempting to only play 1 swamp in a deck that's not heavily black but plays Damnation. But if one of your black sources is Prismatic Vista, you always want to be able to find the second swamp with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point. And I think that's I cannot think of a more apt description, because that comes up all the time. Because in most cases, you are going to be preparing to cast one of those spells that is going to be more taxing on your mana base, and keeping that in mind will allow you to do so. Yeah, great point, Ryan. Yeah, so I feel like in a lot of cases, green decks, it's not that they don't need to draft lands, because I think non-basic lands are still very valuable, but decks that have a higher ability to search basic lands can get away with those other cards, Rampant Growths aside, even just the land fixers. Prismatic Vista is pretty highly desirable, but the other ones that make stuff come into play tapped or whatnot, having a density of those can still do the same amount for your deck without having to potentially fight for other people and draft the other land mana fixers that produce multiple colors of mana as highly. Again, not that you don't want none, but you're in a better position to ignore those when people are fighting for them.
Yeah, and the big thing that I want to stress is just paying attention to that other point where the deck that has a lot of non-basics can play stuff up and down the curve of all of its colors. Once you are the green deck that's trying to rampant growth out lands, your mana curve should be a little bit higher than the other decks to make up for the fact that your early stuff should generally be more green than not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point too. And that goes back to conversation we were having, I think, at episode 21 about exactly that, about just fitting things on your curve, because that changes it.
Mm-hmm.
So, excellent point, Ryan. Anything else on the kind of the math portion of lands before we get into the move away from the science and get more to the art side?
I guess most of what I have are points on the art side of things. So I am all scienced out.
Okay, lovely. All right, let's take a look at the art of drafting lands, and we will be back in just a moment. Have some extra cards laying around that you want to get rid of? Go to starcitygames.com/sell. It has never been easier to turn your cards into cash, or if you're looking to outfit your cube or commander deck with some new favorites, get a 30% trade-in bonus when you choose store credit. No matter what your collection looks like, we have a method for you. Want to see exactly what every card you have is worth? Check out our buy list. Don't have time for that? Stick it on a box. Send it to us, and we'll make you an offer with our ship and sell program. Or if you want a more personal touch, make your way to the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia to sit down with a buyer just like the old days. With the fastest turnaround time in the industry, get an offer in under 4 days when you go to starcitygames.com/sell. Selling has never been easier. So Ryan is all scienced out, which is understandable, because I will agree with him that there is certainly an art and a feel to drafting lands. Are lands, I guess the first question is, are lands signals? When you see lands in draft, what do you consider a signal from seeing a non-basic land in your pack?
I think that lands are signals in much the same way that spells are signals. It's not a one-to-one. There's fewer lands than there are total spells. Not terribly off for all the lands versus all the cards of one color, but I think when you see the best land of a color pair, that's a realistic signal, and it doesn't mean your deck is going to work or do anything great, but if someone passes you a Tropical Island and your deck is Tropical Island and you get some more blue-green spells, like, you can definitely play a blue-green deck. You have been past the ability to do that. And for some higher context stuff, if I believe that a color pair is better than any others, then really any land of that nature, I'm going to be looking for the lands of that color pair. But more generally, if somebody passes me a fetch land, I'm thinking, you don't want Misty Rainforest, then you're not necessarily going to be, you're not sending great signals for me not to fight you on blue and green there. It's not quite the same, but the decks that play gold cards, they're closer to gold cards than anything. I mean, they're freer to put in your deck. It's easier to put a dual land in your deck than to put a 2-color card in your deck, but you want them both in the same deck at the end of the day.
Yes, but one can only cast the other.
Yes. So
Leovold can't put a Tropical Island in play.
And it's an important signal to read too, because in pack 1, if people are passing fetch lands, then you can get some fetch lands, and when a dual land shows up, you'll have the ability to fetch that out. You can have really good mana. But if they're not, which is more common, but if people are not passing lands, then that's your signal in pack 2, pack 3, early in the pack. Hey, if I want some lands, I'm going to need to draft them maybe more highly than I would want to.
I'm glad you got I was getting ready to make that point if you didn't make it, is they can be a signal both ways, not just seeing them, but also not seeing them.
Yep.
And I think that comes up kind of what we were saying in the previous segment is, that's reading your table. if you've seen in the first few packs, you're like, I'll see a handful of lands, I'll be sure to get some of these. And then at the end of the pack, you're like, well, none of these wield. That is meaningful. Mm-hmm. That means you might need to adjust your expectations going into the next pack.
Yes.
Because how people feel about lands probably aren't going to change from pack 1 to pack 2. People are often not going to be like, no, all the ones I saw, I'm satisfied, and everyone else can have the rest.
Yeah, when you specifically see them not wheel, that's a scary sign. And the worse the land is, the worse the sign is. Like when that Stirring Wild one doesn't come back, like don't even think about drafting a green-white card.
I was going to say Temple of Abandon. It's going to be mine. Yeah, if you're like, I'll get this Temple of Abandon, you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
There's 4 cards left in this back, and this is not one of them. Yeah, I agree. Lands are absolutely signals in both directions. I think in most cases, they are the lands that are the best at fixing your mana. Whatever they are in whatever cube you are, there's generally going to be a cycle of lands in any particular cube that is going to be the best at fixing mana, whether that is speed, ease of access, interaction with other cards in the cube. There could be like, in a pauper cube, maybe you have cards that care about gates, which means gates are likely going to be the best cycle of those lands.
Mm-hmm.
I think whatever is the top or the top group of cycles are more important than the best cards that are 2-color cards in that cube. Tropical Island and Misty Rainforest and Breeding Pool are going to be better than pretty much any blue-green card. Even anything but Oko.
I was going to say, we might have picked a bad example.
Yeah, I said blue-green earlier, so I went back to that. There's I don't want to tangent on Oko. There's so few cards. There's so few cards I can think of that happens to be one of them that I happen to pick that color combination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically, when I write my breakdowns for the Magic Online cubes, I will generally highlight the cards that I am happiest to first pick in every color pair, every color, and then I go over gold cards, artifacts, first picks from them. And there's some stuff where the water's a little muddy right below that power level, but in general, if I don't see those cards, then I'm usually looking at lands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I rank lands very highly because I think back in episode 21, I was talking about taking the cards that are most likely to make my decks. Mm-hmm. And I was talking about kind of the more generic, powerful cards, and I would just focus on those and then kind of figure it out as the draft went along. I put lands into those categories, and I'm pretty generous with doing that because I like to draft decks that splash things. There's so many powerful cards in cubes, and this is not just a powered cube, but this is any cube. I mean, across the entire cube, it's just littered with cards that are going to be among the most powerful for whatever you have access in doing, assuming you are doing anything resembling a traditional style cube.
Mm-hmm.
And I will draft those lands, the group that are good at color fixing, very highly, because that's something that I feel like I have the skill to do, is look at a pack and say, is this land going to be more valuable to my deck than whatever card this is? Even if it makes my deck, like, what options does this open me up to later in the draft? Does it work out 100% of the time? No, it doesn't. Sometimes you get a overabundance of lands opportunities, and you take those opportunities rather than taking spells that would be meaningful components of your deck. And then you're looking at your deck and you're like, I got 20 cards. I'm going to put these other 3 cards that I drafted in, even though these are the 3 worst cards in my deck. And that's generally when that's failed.
There's something to be said about that strategy, though. And I think a significant contributor to why we talked about this strategy likely being maybe the winningest way to draft over a large sampling of games. It's because in the games in the middle, the games where your deck's maybe not firing on all cylinders, things could be going better. Once you draft a lot of non-basic lands, you're at least casting your spells. Like, you are shaking the base resource system better than most decks, where you might not have as high of a ceiling as other decks. Decent chance you do have a higher floor. And when you're playing those games in the middle, like maybe your opponent's deck is way more broken than yours. Maybe they have some nonsense, but like they don't draw it, or worse yet, they can't even cast the spells that they do draw. That's just less likely to happen to you. And just winning more of those games in the middle goes a long way.
Yeah, and those are going to be the most average games.
Exactly.
We were talking about
big
the top
dreams,
of the show
like
about
you
variance.
draft your reanimator deck. It's like, I'm going to turn 1 Gristlebrand to everybody, and like you play your third game where it's turn 8 and you've done fuck all. Like that just happens.
Yeah, we're talking about the top of the show about variance and getting yourself in position to reduce variance when you're drawing a random card off the top of your deck and you're like, good, this produces 2 of my colors of mana. I mean, like, it's obviously not that simple, because as we were talking about in the drafting portion, like needing to identify the moments where in the future, when you get to the games, when that's going to come up is very difficult. But that's why this is an art and not just a science, is because learning those situations where you are faced with having the opportunity to advance your deck from a spells perspective and advancing your deck from a reliability and a consistency perspective, you need both, but it's making that balance is going to be on a case by case basis almost every single time.
Yes. And you said that, if you pick a land early, it won't necessarily make your deck, but that's certainly true of the opposite approach,
Yeah, very much.
Especially if you're picking a spell because you think it's one of the best spells in the cube, but it's also in the best color, which tends to be blue. Like if I snap off my Sublime Epiphany in the Arena cube, and then nobody passes me blue cards, and the way the draft is going, it's looking like I'm gonna play a 2-color deck otherwise, and I just don't see the lands to like make the Sublime Epiphany work. Your first pick can end up on the bench no matter what the category is.
Yeah, it might be the best card in your pool and the most uncastable card. As well. So, and I think that I don't know. I don't want to say that drafting lands highly is safer, but I think it raises the floor of your draft, which I guess is kind of safer, but I'm trying to figure out a different way to differentiate those two things.
I don't know. I'm not sure what your aversion to saying it's safer is. I think that's just kind of true. Yeah. Maybe you don't like saying it because it sounds boring, but Justin, it is boring.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, well, I like drafting lands. I'm excited. I love when I'm like, oh my God, I got a 7th pick Watery Grave. I love it. I'm all about that. That's what gets me going on a draft. I'm like, I can do so many things. I'm going to be able to cast so many different spells. Anyway. Okay, so talking about the best lands to draft. I think whatever the group of lands, like I said before, that are the mana fixing lands, I think in a lot of ways, those are going to be critical to most decks. I will put a large asterisk here because for lower power level cubes, or perhaps common, uncommon cubes, one of the biggest differences in those cubes is actually not card quality as much as it is land quality, and more so than land quality is land speed. Because a lot of times when you're doing the fixing in those cubes, those cards are coming into play tapped. Especially with today's Magic, if you're in like a common, uncommon cube, the aggressive decks are not that much slower than they are in a legacy power level cube. But your ability to interact with those, if you are playing a multiple color deck and your lands are coming into play tapped, is different. So that is something you have to keep in mind for the type of cube that you are working with and the cost that you might be incurring to playing too many of those lands in your deck, even if it is making your deck accessible to all of the best cards in the cube.
Yeah, a really good example there is bounce lands are kind of busted in very restricted cubes because it's not 1-to-1. It's not literally drawing you a card, but they kind of draw you a card.
Yeah. I think that they do.
Yeah, they basically do.
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter against the decks that are just killing you quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, draw all the cards you want. Look, you can't mind twist every game that you kill someone when they have cards in their hand. Okay?
Exactly, yeah. So you have a full grip when they cross the finish line. Congratulations. And that is me more often than not in the Pauper and the Peasant cubes, but that's my warning. I've lived it. Don't be like me.
Yeah, everyone inevitably will. If you like drafting lands, and there's some people that just don't. I've cubed with people that are just like, I don't care about lands. I'm just gonna whatever. What's your punchiest deck? What are your top 3 punchiest decks? That's what I'm gonna be doing. It's like, all right. But for a lot of people that I think I like to do both. There's nothing that I don't generally enjoy in cube, and there's nothing that I love above everything else. But I like drafting lands a lot because I like to have a little sampling of everything. And that's something that you have to keep in mind is how fast are the decks that are trying to kill me, and what is my ability to have my mana fixed at the cost of the speed of interacting with those decks. I said, the lower down you go, it's tough.
That'll be a good tiebreaker for something we discussed earlier. If you're looking at the land late in the pack versus the sideboard card, if it's land that enters the battlefield tapped, maybe it's a card that is good at stopping you from getting run over. That's something to weigh a little bit heavier. I think that Kitchen Finks is among the more underrated cube cards. I'm not saying it's incredible. I'm just saying it goes in a lot of decks and goes into even more sideboards, and you're able to board it in relevantly way more than other cards that I see picked over it.
Yeah, I think Kitchen Finks, as an aside on this card, has gotten less sexy over the years, but it has not got less playable.
Kitchen Finks is dependable. And you know what? When you get to be my age, you appreciate that.
Look, here's the thing about Kitchen Finks. It's not... Look, I know when you look at it on the face, you're like, oh, it's 3 power. It can gain you 4 life. It can die and come back. That's true, and there's obviously cards have gotten better. But because of that, here's the things that haven't changed. Okay, they haven't changed the life total that you start the game with. They also have not changed, and in fact, the opposite, as time goes on, the creatures are not generally getting more toughness. In fact, the power toughness ratio continues to slightly slant towards power over toughness for a lot of cube cards, especially the ones that are trying to kill you. So Kitchen Finks is doing as good of a job as it always has. It's just not fancy anymore. I remember when Kitchen Finks, that's right when I started cubing, when Kitchen Finks was like a brand new card, had just come out within the year. And it was like, oh my God, this card's incredible. This is the best. This is one of the best white cards. And this time green was also not great in cubes. Green and white were the 2 worst colors. So it's like, this card is like a godsend. And it still does the job that it's always done. It's just that it's not as fun to play with Kitchen Finks anymore, but it's still going to roll its sleeves up and do all of the things that it used to do. And you're going to really, it's a reminder to appreciate it when people are trying to attack you with creatures and reduce your life total to 0. Kitchen Finks doesn't let that happen quite as easily.
Yeah, real workhorse. Kitchen Finks has never done me wrong.
No, agreed. Okay, last note for this particular section. I wanted to talk about the lands that have basic land types versus the cards that search the basic land types. And everyone knows how good fetch lands are when you see them. We talked about fetch lands last week and the week prior. They provide more than just fixing, but there are other lands that still do that in lower power cubes, like the what is it? The Rocky Tar Pit cycle. Maybe if you don't have Bloodstained Mire, you're like, all right, Rocky Tar Pit. Look, Rocky Tar Pit into the green black snow land that comes into play tap that there's a forest and a swamp. That still works. That's still good fix, and it's slow, but it does fix your mana.
And
so go ahead.
I mean, I just think that in the rarity restricted cubes, the 5-color decks gain even more. I mean, the point you made about the aggressive decks being able to close pretty quickly is certainly true and resonant, and you should show some respect to that, if not in your main deck, in your sideboard. But a lot of the games in the common, uncommon cubes, the rarity restricted cubes, or even just lower power level cubes, are just about who can do something bigger than the other player. And having access to more colors gives you more looks at more bigger things.
Yeah. One of my favorite cards to draft in common, uncommon cubes, and this one I don't think it stood the test of time, but I do believe that my win percentage when I cast this card is very high, is good old Ribbons of Night.
Yeah, Ribbons of Night is not what it used to be.
It is not. It is not what it used to be. But it is the look. I'll play my first 4 cards that are my first 4 lands coming to play tapped, and then 5th land, hit that one untapped, hit that Ribbons of Night, gain back a couple of turns. That's good. That's good magic right there. That's good. That's good common, uncommon magic. But yes, I do agree that if you are able to prioritize more defensively minded cards, being able to cast the larger swath of cards, a larger swath of spells, because you have developed your mana base both in the draft and in the game, in rarity restricted cubes, is often more valuable there, because it's more difficult for other decks to overcome those things.
Yep.
Where in the higher rarity cubes, you have the decks have the bag of tricks is wider. It's generally pretty narrow in the rarity restricted, the power level restricted cubes.
Yeah.
So,
and a good way to think about it, if you think about constructed formats, generally, there's some exceptions here, but generally, as you widen the card pool, therefore increase the power level, the pressure to have a lower mana curve, the value of cheap stuff just goes up dramatically. And that's going to be true in your lower power level cube and your rarity restricted cubes, where in your legacy and your vintage cube, you better have a plan with your mana curve. You better be accelerating your mana and or disrupting your opponent's mana, because that's the whole game more often than a lot of players realize. When it comes to lower power levels, just being able to cast a 7-drop if your opponent's only casting a 6-drop, that matters. And there's less pressure on you. There's less that hinders your ability to do that. It's not the case where your red deck is concerned if it has to play 1 or more 5-drops. It's the case where, like, charging Monstrosaur is just a good, honest way for a red deck to close in those environments. And decks just kind of go that long, and being able to do the biggest thing at the end matters more than being able to keep up early.
Yeah, I think that is very, very apt.
Yeah, and then the more true that is, the more you can afford to play lands that enter tap that make more colors.
I would suggest, if let's say you are either a cube owner that maybe hasn't thought about conceptualize like how far can my drafters push the limits of doing this, or maybe you're a drafter and one of your friends has a cube that fits kind of what we're talking about. I would just try this. See how far you can push this. I bet you and the cube owner will learn more about their cube than they probably had expected.
Yeah.
Because that's something that happens. It happens on, I say, a pretty regular amount of time in non-rarity restricted cubes, where you have access to all of the best fixing. But in rarity restricted cubes, I think people don't think about doing that as frequently. At least in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's just drafting Izzet Guildgate's a lot less exciting than drafting Volcanic Island. But in the respected formats, it matters at least as much.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Ryan, any other thoughts before we take our last mandatory break?
I think that just this section here is a lot closer to how I think about it and how I put things into practice. It is useful to know which cards are better or worse. It's more important to be really in the weeds, looking at the context of things. It's useful to know that Scalding Tarn is great. It's better to know when you might be interested in passing it. Better still to pay attention to all the lands, what's coming back around, what isn't, and then modifying how you approach lands going into the deeper packs.
Definitely. Okay. We're going to take our last break and finish up our discussion on lands in just one moment.
What's up, gamers? Taking a break from the pod here to talk to you about Star City Games Premium. Now, I know many of you are already Premium members. That's awesome. You're awesome. Thank you for that. If you are not already enrolled in SCG Premium, we need to talk. You are leaving a value on the table for $7.99 a month. You get access to 5% off of Magic Sealed product, 10% off of all Magic singles, 15% off of supplies. Now, I know that I'm talking to a lot of Cube owners here. I know that you're going to buy more sleeves. You know you are going to save this money right back on sleeves alone. So that's reason enough for you to enroll. But I am not done yet, not by a long shot. You also get tons of exclusive content from a fantastic stable of writers. We're talking about Jerry Thompson, Paulo Vitor Dama Rosa, Patrick Sullivan, Autumn Burchett, Brad Nelson, Sheldon Memory, Ross Merriam, Todd Anderson, Shaheen Sarani, Michael Majors, Ryan Sachs, Ari Lax, Dominic Harvey, Cedric Phillips. The list goes on and on. My stuff, you can get that every week for free. You're welcome. But now I am asking a favor. Go ahead, get enrolled for SCG Premium. Go to starcitygames.com/join-premium. Sign up today. And let's get back to the podcast.
All right, so you're in the draft. We've sold you on the importance of lands, or we reaffirmed your belief in lands. So I outlined a scenario earlier in the podcast where I was sitting beside someone, and they, as they stated before the draft, they were like, I love drafting lands. I'm going to draft a lot of lands. And they did. So I was faced with not being able to draft many lands, and I like drafting lands, so I was like, well, I would like some of those. I didn't get them. Ended my deck with 2. But at the end of the draft, we were both in a blue and black deck. And the card quality of the cards that I had, that I was being passed from this player that was drafting a lot of lands, was significantly higher than the person who ended up with, I think, 11 or 12 non-basic lands, all in their kind of their 3-color deck. I obviously was only in a 2-color deck. But we looked at the end, and I was like, I didn't even know you were in this color combination because you kept passing me these cards. And they're like, well, I was just drafting lands. What they ultimately didn't realize is there's a point when you need to identify what is going to be a meaningful card for my deck. So how early is too early for lands? The answer to me is it's not too early. Pack 1, pick 1, draft a land. But how long should that go on before you know when to stop drafting lands? When have you had enough? When have you identified that whatever card that I'm passing, maybe this is a card that's going to be more important to my strategy than my 9th land that is a tangential fixer to my card I might be splashing?
Yeah, I think that I strongly agree. It's never too early. You can open an incredible draft with a pack 1, pick 1 land, especially if other players are passing you some things. They get in their head off of their pack 1, pick 1. They stay the course in some strategy that causes them to pass kind of a role player. And if you have kind of a broad range of strategies you're looking to get into, I pull a lot of examples for Vintage Cube because I think that's the cube that has the widest audience with the most experience. But there's some obvious stuff that you should pick really early, Power, Ancestor Recall. There's signals of fast mana. We talk about fast mana a lot, but it's not uncommon that you get like a pack 1, pick 5 recurring Nightmare, which is not the most powerful, but it's better than most of what's going on, like in the history of Magic.
Yeah, I think it's pretty close to the most powerful, objectively. Look,
yeah, if you're good recurring Nightmare deck is incredible.
I'll put it this way. There's 24 first picks in that draft. I bet it's one of the 24 best cards.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I use it as an example is because it does go later than it probably should, and only so many decks can play it. So you do see it later in the pack. I know you don't play Magic Online, but take my word for it.
I'm glad. That would upset me. That Recurring Nightmare is my favorite card in all of Cube.
Well, you're more likely to be able to draft it because it goes so late.
That's just... I'm just getting upset, so I'll let you just continue.
Anyway, if you're taking those lands early, again, it's never too early. Lands can start the draft great. Something is going to be undervalued at some point. Usually, it's not always the case, but usually. And you shouldn't pass great cards with the expectation that something better is going to be open, because if you have a look at great cards, you usually don't get two. But the point is,
yes,
if you're on the fence, a land is a really solid place to start. And then you do want to eventually jump onto something that is being undervalued. Or if nothing undervalued shows up, you do just have to cling to something functional. Like at some point, your deck has to be about something.
Yes, it's like you pulled it right out of my mouth, which is why I saw it, because I was like, well, there's not always a guarantee that's going to happen.
Yeah, see, you didn't react to what I said at all, so I knew that I had missed something, and so that was really helpful.
Well, I was forming my reaction because I was going to be like, well, that's not a promise that always happens. Well, that's the danger, though. That is the danger. Is we're going back to opportunity cost. You are giving up something when you are drafting lands.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be times, I would say, if you are committed to trying to identify when you should draft a land versus when you should draft a functional deck helping non-land, you are going to miss and make the wrong decision at several points. Maybe not necessarily several points at the same draft, but that happens to even seasoned drafters. You know, people that draft Cube all the time, that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But that's why it is the art portion, because one, this is a constantly evolving process. Every single time you're faced with this decision is in most cases the first time you're faced with that exact decision with that exact amount of information. It's going to be rare. It's going to be 6th pick and you've drafted the exact 5 cards and you've passed all of the same cards in the 5 prior packs. That's not going to have happen. Cube, by the nature of the format, is in most cases extremely singleton, and you are going to have little bits of different information that's going to inform things. And even if you're making the right decision at the time, the draft is going to continue and it's going to reflect on that decision poorly or positively, and you might not have control over that either. Well, in a lot of cases, you're not going to have control because, like we were saying, it is not promised that you will be able to have that opportunity to draft something later, or whether it be spells or lands.
To illustrate the point about never facing the exact decision twice, this is kind of a fun stats factoid. If you never heard this one, it might blow your mind, but the odds that a deck of playing cards, a 52 card deck with 4 different suits, is in an exact order, it's 1 in 10 to the power of 68. Like, you just don't get the exact permutation every time. So you need to really be in the weeds about the theory behind it and understanding what matters. And if it's not obvious in the first blush, then you at least need to know what it means based off of what cards come back to you in the draft. And you can often salvage things in pack 2 and 3, especially if you get lucky and open something really nice. That's some variance in the game that is good to have. Variance is not all bad. Sometimes it is your friend. You got to count those. But being able to roll with the punches is incredibly important because you don't see the same thing twice.
In most cases, that's weird. That's different than what I hear, Ryan. Usually when people open bad packs, it is variance. And when people open good packs, it's justice. It's justice, yes. It is deserved karma that they have accrued over opening the bad packs. Maybe I'm drafting with different people, I guess.
I have heard that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad that's not unique to just what I've heard. Yes. I think that comes up pretty frequently, that people assume that if you open it, I mean, theoretically it's going to, because this, again, rounding back to math, that and I'm trying to put this in a lens of drafting lands. You are going to increase your chances of opening a very good card that is going to be castable and important to your deck later in the draft if you focus on drafting lands more often. But again, it is not a promise, because it is still variance, and you might not get the karma you so richly deserve by opening packs poorly prior in life. Okay, just throw that out there for everybody.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're not always due when you want to be.
Yeah, I would say most cases you're not.
Yeah, actually, well, some would say you're never due, which is the reality of the situation.
I have a question. When people invoke the one time, have you ever heard someone invoke one time and then never again? Just a single one time.
The first time I became familiar with the Magic player calling for a one time, I was watching a stream, and I only was aware they were doing it because they wouldn't fucking stop saying it. They called for one time like 10
every
times
turn
in a game, and that was it for me watching them.
Oh man!
But it is commonplace. You can't just keep calling for one time. So it's not you're not owed anything. Draft better.
That is your one time. You passed it up 45 minutes ago in the middle of pack 2. That was your one time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone has someone in their play group that is the one time guy. You know who they are.
If you're lucky, you only have one.
Yeah. Okay. To sum up, I really like drafting lands. I like draft lands highly. It almost doesn't matter the cube, but there is a danger to it. And sometimes that sweet, sweet nectar of fixing your mana will come back and bite you when you get run over by an Adanto Vanguard. And that's just how it goes sometimes.
And I like to run people over with the Adanto Vanguard, but
yeah,
I have respect for the lands.
Yeah, that's good. Two pieces of the pie if it was cut exactly down the middle, and there's only 2 pieces. Okay, Ryan, anything else on lands for today before we close out?
Last thing, this is something that I did bring up on a previous episode of the pod and alluded to it a little bit earlier in this episode, but beyond certain lands being more powerful than others, beyond fetch lands being the best of the bunch, beyond lands that open you up to more colors at lower cost being better, triomes are freer to draft than creature lands in a lot of situations, that sort of thing. If you identify or you believe that a certain color pair is where you want to be in the draft, and maybe it is you just like it, but the example that I think is more resonant and something that I write about playing to win in Cube is if you think blue and green is where you want to be, then Vine Glimmer Snarl is a higher pick than any Mardu card. So once you decide, okay, I really want to play these color pairs, then drafting even the worst lands highly is a really important tool to making that work consistently.
All right. I think that's a great note to end on. If you want to subscribe to the 540, you can do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, your local podcast app, wherever you're listening at the time. Please leave us a review if you're able, whether that be a little star review. The more, the better. And words are often kind as well. Help that algorithm. It is a hungry beast and it does need to be fed. We can't do it alone. If you want to find me, I'm on Twitter at jparnell1. My other podcast, Think Twice, you can find by searching Think Twice MTG wherever you're listening at the time or any of the aforementioned places above. It's a magic and pop culture podcast. I actually talked about my cubes in more detail last week on that show. So if you're wanting to hear about that, it is the last episode of Think Twice. 200, I don't even know, 205, 6. It's one of those. It's a very high number.
That's a high number.
Yeah, we've been doing it for a long time. When we started that podcast, I just did not know how long. You just never know how long it's going to go.
Yeah,
and it just kept going. So yeah, we're in the 200 and single digits. Anyway,
that rules.
Think Twice MTG. Find that podcast. Hear me talk about my cube more in detail. And of course, I'm on Commander Versus on YouTube and StarCityGames.com. Ryan, what you got?
You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Overdrive. You can find my articles weekly on StarCityGames.com. We are in a stretch of a bunch of rotating Magic Online Spotlight cubes. This week, by the time you're hearing this, should have Ellie Rice's Teamer Cube back on Magic Online for the second run. Ellie was recently added to, what's that Commander thing? You would know.
The Commander Advisory Group.
The CAG.
Yes.
Congratulations to Ellie, and also really cool to have Ellie's Cube back on Magic Online. You can find my breakdown on the updates to that. The list, as I understand it, is pretty significantly different. So that will be a good one to check out and a fun cube to play. Then Ryan Sachs is going to be the week after. SCG's own Ryan Sachs gets an opportunity to show off his cube on Magic Online. And I cover all those Spotlight cubes on StarCityGames.com. And you can find the updates on those and what I'm writing about on my Twitter at Ryan Overdrive.
Love it. Well, our section about drafting is done. Our section about lands is done. Looks like Innistrad's right around the corner. So enjoy another 4 months of preview episodes from us coming up. Maybe we can take a week off or so. Anyway, that is everything for today. Thank you all for listening to the 540. We'll catch you next time.